delight to be with everyone today. Let me just start sharing my screen here. Okay, so I hope everyone can see and hear all right. So I want to stress from the outset that I am at the start of this project, not the end of this project. So this will be a very preliminary paper. And what I'm really hoping to do today is to connect with like-minded researchers and people who support research, as well as receive feedback and suggestions on the project and where it might go next. Basically, in December, I applied for the very first iteration of something called the AHRC RLUK, so RLUK is Research Libraries UK, Professional Practice Fellowship, which is designed to involve libraries and specifically librarians more in the process of doing research, recognizing that there's this kind of gap as well as an outdated model of librarians sort of being behind the scenes and facilitating things but not necessarily being partners and collaborators. So the fellowship program is hopefully designed to change that. About 2 weeks ago, I found out that I'd gotten one of these, which is very, very exciting. And that sort of changed a little bit what I was going to come and talk to you about today into a very kind of preliminary presentation of what the project is and why I'm doing it and some of the background behind it. So essentially the project is about PhD students' development of digital research skills, because such skills are really a fundamental part of PhD research in the 21st century. Doctoral researchers produce, consume, and interact with all manner of information in digital environments. And so the larger project is really looking at how doctoral researchers in history learn to find and use digital resources in academic libraries, and how training programs in digital skills could be improved to support lifelong learning and skills development after the PhD is over. And what we're going to be doing today, just a little bit about the structure of where we're going to go next, is I want to talk a lot about the project context, so exploring a bit one of the gaps that the project intends to fill, which is particularly the connection between the assumptions that get made about students' digital skills by supervisors, by learning support staff and research developers, and students' own self-assessment and understanding of these skills. I think there's a lot of wonderful work that's been done by professional organizations like VTI and other groups to kind of make sense of what the general skills and general landscape look like, but there still seems to be a pretty persistent gap between all of that good work and what, in my professional experience, students are actually doing and understanding. So I'm going to draw a lot on my experience of supporting research students in the University of Lincoln's doctoral school, as well as students and staff in our School of History and Heritage and our School of Performing Arts, which is what I've done since 2017. So a bit of background for those of you who don't know me: I am a subject librarian who supports the Arts and Humanities at the University of Lincoln. I'll talk more about my role and what I do as the talk goes on. But I also have a academic and research background, specifically in medieval history, which is where I did my PhD. So, kind of we'll go into the broad context of the project. And then I'll talk a bit about defining digital literacies in a PGR context specifically, and some of the frameworks and the work that's been done around that. And then I'll really kind of go into a bit more of my professional background and how I support the development of digital literacies, things I've done so far, things that I'd like to do, and then I'll kind of conclude and hopefully get our discussion off to a good start by talking about some of the preliminary conclusions and next steps I have so far. So really, overall, that kind of final reflection is hopefully going to be about um, what I've learned so far about the ways to help students improve their confidence and capacity in digital skills. And I'm really delighted to be here with researchers and colleagues who are specifically interested in student mental health, because I think the issue of confidence or lack of confidence is something that really impacts, especially research students' mental well-being. So it will be really wonderful to speak to people who are experts in that field and to get your feedback and your suggestions about how to incorporate that into the project. This isn't a project specifically about student mental health, but I think, as has hopefully been made clear from that introduction, I think it intersects with it in a lot of important ways. And so I want to be aware of it as I go on. So I want to say a little bit about the project so far. So it's going to be an 8-month project beginning in the summer of 2022, running until the spring of 2023. And where this really comes from is my role as an arts and humanities librarian and noticing over the past 4 or 5 years of my work in that role, a pretty persistent need for student training in digital literacy skills, especially those related to finding and using information. So there's really 4 things I'm going to try and do over the course of the project. I think the first thing is to try and audit training programs for doctoral researchers in order to identify gaps in digital skills training. So I'm looking specifically at my own institution, the University of Lincoln, and also at 12 peer institutions, which I've identified as such as part of the Lincoln Research and Enterprises team's work on the 2021 Culture, Employment, and Development in Academic Research survey. So looking at institutions that have the same kind of, or a similar kind of research culture that we do. I'll kind of talk a little bit more about the Lincoln context as we go on. Second thing I want to do is obviously speak to a number of doctoral researchers themselves about their own self-perceptions of digital skills, partly to be able, when I share my findings and what I learn, to communicate them in ways that will be intelligible to the community I'm really trying to serve and interact with. But also to, again, kind of focus on perhaps skills gaps and confidence or lack of confidence. And I think particularly trying to connect and interact with researchers whose work involves significant engagement with digital archives and discovery tools. And then the third thing is to kind of speak specifically with librarians and with research supervisors' perceptions of PhD students' digital skills development. And this is both in the sense of trying to develop a few specific case studies with libraries and archives, but also to kind of maybe think about ways that supervisors and librarians and research developers can maybe be a little bit more in dialogue, because one of the things I sort of noticed over the course of my work is that sometimes there are these parallel conversations happening, or kind of completely divergent conversations happening. It would be really good to try and bring things hopefully together a little bit more. And then the final thing is really trying to put it all into context by analyzing scholarly literature on digital skills, but particularly focusing in part because of the Lincoln Context. Colleagues at Lincoln have just done a big collaborative project on online reading. So I really want to look specifically at digital skills and online reading, and that's to really start to perhaps bridge the gap between finding information and using it, because I think that's something that maybe tends to happen particularly on the library side of research support, is that that's sort of what happens next after someone's found the information tends to be a bit less considered. And of course, it's so important for shaping how someone actually searches. And then the overall aim of that fourth stage of the project as well is to try and design new workshops on digital discovery and on online reading to kind of fill out some of the things we do already. So the project is focusing specifically on history students, in part because that's a group I work very, very closely with, but also because I think it's a really interesting discipline, and the discipline is at a really interesting stage for thinking about digital skills and digital skills development. And there are three major reasons for that. The first thing is the very interesting kind of practice in a lot of history research at the moment of using electronic materials as though they were print. So treating an ebook or approaching an ebook as though it were a print book, approaching an electronic journal article as though it were the same as the print version, and so on. So I think there's an interesting kind of methodological issue there to kind of dig into. At the same time that there's a kind of focus on treating research materials as kind of their print forms, the discipline is heavily reliant on the use of digital discovery tools and things like electronic catalogs to kind of find research materials and information. And particularly over the course of the pandemic, there was a really highly, as I'm sure there was in all of our areas of work, there was a much increased reliance on digitized primary sources as a way of accessing information and doing research in a world where getting into the physical archives or museums or collections was just not really at all possible. So all of these fall broadly within the overall cloud of digital literacies, I think. And the reason I really like to kind of start with this definition, so the idea that digital literacies are those capacities which fit an individual for living, learning, and working in a digital society, is because I think it focuses the question really, really well on the fact that these skills are not just about what someone does during their PhD, but are instead about lifelong engagement with the world, and not just engagement in a fixed way or at a fixed point, but also the capacity to be a lifelong learner in these skills as new technologies and new ways of working come to the fore. So I'm going to get into a little bit about some of the kind of frameworks and ideas around digital literacies. So in 2014, JISC published a kind of big project that they had done on digital literacies running for about the 4 years prior. I think it started in 2010, 2011. And what that very helpfully did is kind of break digital literacies down into a bunch of different areas. So not just kind of looking at the sense of, in what librarians kind of classically call information literacy, so that finding, interpreting, evaluating, managing, and sharing information, but also the much kind of wider cluster and context of skills and domains where those areas kind of take place. So I think it's a really good framework to work with and kind of think about, because it very much brings to the fore and kind of reminds us of all of the different areas of someone's work, someone's development, research, and sharing research that this impacts. So very much kind of looking at this framework and putting the context of my work on training and development into this context. The other framework I'm very much looking at is the VTI Researcher Development Framework, which was developed initially in 2009 as part of a general emphasis among funders and research organizations on establishing the meaning and value of research as a career, what makes for a quote-unquote good researcher across various stages of development. And I think one of the things that this framework has also done, which is maybe a little bit after the fact, and sort of side bonus that maybe wasn't initially intended, perhaps, was giving a kind of structure and focus to the emerging field of research development and research support, which I think is really a field that's very much kind of come to the fore within the last 10 years or so. And one of the things that seems to be increasing is that activity around the researcher development framework has really widened to include not just the research itself, but the training and support that helps to make that possible. So the RDF, which I'm sure many of you are probably pretty familiar with, is divided into 4 major domains with lots of examples of the different kind of skills and capabilities that surround those specific areas. I think it's been, kind of pitched very well to be broadly applicable across lots and lots of different fields. But one of the things I, so far only anecdotally, but I'm sure this is perhaps backed up by more formal research as well, find is that there can be difficulties understanding and applying it in specific contexts. And if I turn to my own experience when I was a PhD student, the research and development framework was definitely around. I don't think I really knew about it or engaged with it very much because of that sort of challenge of seeing how to fit it into my kind of specific context. And so if we kind of try and look and start to unpack that context a little bit, we can obviously think a bit about digital skills, especially digital literacy skills, falling mostly into that kind of first domain of the framework of knowledge and intellectual abilities. But of course, those skills really kind of impact in many ways, sort of all across the different areas of the framework. They're not just limited to that one area. So that's the kind of context in which I'm trying to situate my work and connect some of the things I'm trying to develop and explore. So I want to talk a little bit now about the PGR context, specifically at Lincoln. There's just under 3,200 postgraduate students at the university as of last year. And of that, just under 3,200, just under 600 are postgraduate research students. Most of these are in areas like the sciences, especially biological and sports sciences, psychology, um, but also a kind of strong concentration in the social sciences and education. And for the field I'm specifically looking in, which is history, the numbers are kind of in the mid-range. We had about 30 history PGRs last year. So part of the reason I'm not doing the project solely on the Lincoln history community is I want to sort of see PGR training in history across a much wider context. So the doctoral school has a researcher development program, which I have been very excited to contribute to since the 2018-2019 academic year. And that really falls into four main categories, focusing on research skills, communication, writing and publishing, and career development. And all of these different skills and programs are really mapped onto the research and development framework. So looking at specific areas where students can explore and develop in that context. So I want to talk now a little bit about some of the things I've done so far with digital skills. And over the course of the past few years, I've participated in and contributed the development of 6 workshops, which contribute to different areas of digital skills for researchers. And since 2021, so since last year, I've been the liaison librarian for the doctoral school. So I'm continuing to hopefully work quite closely with my lovely colleagues there. It's wonderful to see a few of you here. And I think one of the things I'm looking to do with this program of workshops that have been developed so far is to find ways within the course of the project to figure out sensible areas to start expanding into. Especially, I think, in the areas of publication and scholarly communication. My own experience as a PhD student was that there was very little information out there about open access, and what there was very difficult to relate to my specific experience and the avenues of publication that I understood were open to me as an early career researcher. And I think particularly with increasing funder mandates and emphasis on open access, it's kind of really important to, kind of develop more knowledge and ideas around that, especially since because it's a new and developing area. This might not necessarily be something that all supervisors are able to signpost or guide their students on necessarily. So that's, the kind of academic publishing area is something I'm really interested in and digging into and exploring further. But I want to talk now about 2 specific skills workshops that I've developed and a little bit about what I've done with those and why I've done them. So the first of these I started developing in 2018, so a few years ago now, which was actually on Microsoft Word for long documents and dissertations. And this came very much out of my memories of my own experience as a PhD student, trying frantically to correct, update, and format my table of contents the night before submission. Really stuck with me as a moment. But also because in supporting students, researchers, both at the undergraduate and PhD level or postgraduate level, I really noticed that there were these 5 little things that people weren't necessarily aware of, but that could make the process of putting together a longer document much easier and more comfortable to kind of navigate and edit and manage. So it's been very interesting to see that there's still, as I work with new PGRs who come into the university, there still seems to be a kind of persistent need for that workshop and that sort of type of almost kind of IT skills focused training. Another workshop I've developed in that area, which actually came up at kind of midway through, I think 2020, in the summer of 2020, I started designing and delivering this, and it was actually at the request of students in our Center for Doctoral Training in Agri-Food Robotics, which is at our university's campus in Riseholm. Was actually about navigating online meetings with confidence and sort of specifically focusing on attending, participating, and presenting at those online meetings. And I found when I've delivered this workshop, which I've now done about 4 or 5 times, there's particularly engagement with the students around how to find and identify meeting opportunities. So where to kind of locate online conferences or opportunities to give online talks. We've had some really good engagement and discussions around online meeting etiquette and what to do and when to mute and how to engage in the chat and all of those things. And I think it has brought to mind a very interesting point, which is as we go forward, it's easy to think that because we've been doing this for so long, everyone knows how to do online meetings, so no one has to talk about it, because we all know what we're doing. So that's been a really interesting experience. I want to just start to wrap up by talking really quickly about some of the individual support I try and offer to doctoral students as a subject librarians. So that's particularly around things like introducing them to the library and its resources at the start of the degree, but also as things kind of go on throughout the degree, helping them with finding and accessing research materials, and particularly brought to the fore by the pandemic, helping them with access to materials online and at a distance. And one of the things I really find with that is that navigating an electronic catalog is a skill that touches on multiple domains of the researcher's knowledge base and cognitive abilities. That's sort of area 1 of the VTI framework, but it's typically taught in one-off sessions by librarians during the BA, and Masters. So even when they get to the level of the research degree, students tend to be unaware of how a catalog is made or how it works and why it works, it's organized the way it is. So sometimes they're treating the library website as though it were Google, and then that's not really working out so well. So that's, I think, something very much I'm going to be digging into as the project develops. So one of the things I've also been doing along the way is really working with colleagues in the library to form a peer learning network around research support. So we started doing this sort of very slowly and in small steps in 2019 after a couple of us went to different conferences in the field. And what we're really interested in is kind of building a peer learning network about research and research projects amongst ourselves, finding ways to improve our information about support for researchers and ways that we can signpost people more effectively to things that will help them. And one of the things I'm really excited about now is um, across different teams within our library at Lincoln, we actually have a lot of PhD students who are working part-time as library assistants. And so we've been starting to collaborate with them on the development and creation of events like writing retreats and other things, potentially panel events where students actually share their experiences of things like routes to publication and applying for small grants. So a way both to kind of build community and connection among students and hopefully help with their confidence and feeling of isolation, um, but also for us to have hopefully a kind of ongoing dialogue with researchers where they are now. So I want to conclude now by saying a bit about kind of preliminary conclusions and next steps for the work. And in many ways, as you can probably tell as I've been talking, this is not a research project I would have thought of doing before 2020 necessarily. I think the pandemic really brought to light the need for digital literacy skills and a renewed need to continue and take forward conversations that have been happening for a decade or more around those skills. I haven't quite talked so much about this, but one of the things I've very much noticed is the ways that these skills are often assumed or taken for granted, maybe sometimes by researchers themselves, but I think especially by research supervisors and librarians. And finally, the need to have a way to kind of create a bridge or a translation between broad general frameworks and the specific disciplinary contexts that researchers operate in. So thank you so much for listening to my talk today. I very much look forward to your questions and your suggestions and your thoughts. And I would love to connect with people about some of these issues. I am on LinkedIn, and you can also follow the project as it develops on my project blog. So thank you again, and I look forward to our conversation.